Hi everyone, I'm Dr.Animaction, and welcome to the latest episode of the Personnel Office, covering the final single-carded Joe figure of 1982. This is the series where I take a look at each team member in a real-world context and evaluate their equipment and training against actual U.S. military operations and standards, or at least as close as I can get, seeing as I've been out of the military for 20 years now. For today's topic, we'll be looking at the Joe's original machine gunner, surfer dude, and power lifter, Rock and Roll. Before we start though, one quick announcement. Before I head straight into the animated 70s, I realized that I've yet to take a look at the animated 90s in film, so I'm going to do that real quick before moving on. I say real quick, but there are a ton of them, so it may be a 2 or 3 part video. But on with the 70s as soon as I finish. Now let's throw up some devil horns and get to the rock. Like always, we'll start by taking a look at the front of Rock and Roll's card, taking a quick second to chat about his codename. It seems pretty straightforward, especially once you read the rest of the character's file card, but I think there are actually more than one meaning to it. To me, it means both the obvious, but also means to kick things off, as in let's rock and roll.
Let's rock!
That idea is supported by the fact that he's the guy on the Joe team carrying the M60 machine gun. Traditionally, when setting an ambush, you place the 60 or whatever machine gun you have at the front of the unalive zone, and the gunner is the one who initiates the ambush once the majority of the enemy have gone by. Or to put it another way, he's the one who decides when it's time to rock and roll. And that's why I think, as it is with most of the Joes in this lineup, it's a codename with multiple meanings practical to the character. I've got some thoughts based on the art and character design too, but we'll go ahead and delve more into those later. For now, let's flip this thing over and take a peek at the file card itself. Starting from the top, we see plenty that I don't have an issue with. Giving him the label of machine gunner is fine, as that's a position or a duty rather than an MOS. We see later that his MOS is infantry, and that's exactly right. Machine gunners are regular 11 Bravo infantry assigned a specialized weapon, so it's not any special training. We all learn to perform field maintenance on a machine gun and spend the day firing one in basic training. In fact, I drew the short straw and had to carry ours for the majority of our final road march in AIT back from our graduation FTX, or field training exercise. We also see that he's regular Army due to the RA on the front of his serial number. Things get a little shaky with his secondary military specialty since he's listed as a PT, or physical training instructor. The closest the Army has to such a thing is an additional training class called Master Fitness Trainer School. It doesn't necessarily give you any additional titles or jobs though, and usually PT is led by a squad leader or a platoon sergeant. There aren't really any dedicated PT instructors. When I was at Fort Bragg, or I guess Fort Liberty now, we had an exchange officer who was a captain from the British Army's Paras. He was pretty hardcore and often felt like a 10-mile run over hills was a good daily workout. It's really luck of the draw on any given day. Finally, in this top section, we see that he's from Malibu and he has a grade of E5, or Sergeant. This actually makes him one of the highest ranking of the original single-carded Joes, at the same level of the 3 S's, Snake Eyes, Scarlet, and Stalker. In the regular Army, you wouldn't really see something like this, since E5s would be team leaders or squad leaders, leaving gunner duties to junior enlisted ranks. Moving on, we see that he was a surfer, bass player, well, hence the obvious meaning of his codename, and a weightlifter. That last one makes sense, since the M60 weighs in and around 24 pounds, not including ammo. It was hard for Hasbro to show that in this initial line though, with so many reused body parts, though the modern classified version makes it pretty evident. It also fits that the larger bore 7.62mm M60 is a more percussive sounding gun than any of the others in the modern US inventory. Looking at the final bit of this middle section of the card, we see that he graduated at the top of his class in AIT, meaning Honor Graduate, which is a title that's awarded in every class.
Training, sir!
What kind of training, son?
Army training, sir!
And that he's a graduate of Covert Ops School, which I'm going to simply assume means Ranger School. Most Covert Ops teams don't bring along a machine gunner. It's a pretty loud and pretty bulky weapon. Finally, we get to the flavor text, which speaks about him being reliable and loyal. Reliability is an important trait in a machine gunner, seeing as they're often deployed behind the rest of the unit in a support by fire position providing overwatch, which also means they're the ones who will be covering any retreat or exfiltration. If they run before everyone else clears the AO, area of operations, then you're pretty much left hanging. Interestingly, in the comics, Snake Eyes is shown carrying the M60 for his squad in Vietnam, which is a good demonstration that a 60 gunner, or in a modern platoon I guess an M240 Bravo gunner, isn't always the biggest guy in the unit. But anyway, that's about it for the file card, so let's move on to the figure itself. I'd say we'll look at the molded figure first, but there's not a lot to see here. He's got those same brown tanker-looking boots I've mentioned before, and a couple pouches on his thighs that are holding who knows what. He's also got the standard LBE web belt that the other Joes of the era have, unsurprisingly, since they all pretty much share the same waist mold. The thing that sets him apart are the crossed ammo belts on his chest. That's kind of a common trope of the era and seen in a lot of media regarding the Vietnam-era military. So the question is, how realistic is it? Well, although it's true that soldiers of the time would carry ammo in such a manner, it's honestly not something you'd see a lot. That's mostly because of two reasons. The first is that the links holding the rounds together can be pulled apart with a somewhat minor twist, and since we wear so much other gear, there's plenty for belts like that to get caught on. Not to mention branches or whatever other obstacles you have to walk through. The other is that when they're loose like this, those belts can be pretty noisy. I can't imagine the Joes being the type of team that wants someone in the field with them sounding like they're carrying around a couple large bags of quarters, which rock and roll definitely would. Normally these ammo belts would actually come in thin cloth bags with built-in shoulder straps. These bags could also be hung from the bottom of the gun, but have a tendency to snag and cause jams. It's perfectly normal to pull out the belts when you set up a firing position, but not to carry them that way. Oh, and wearing them on your chest makes low crawling nearly impossible, which no infantryman wants. The only last molded aspect of the figure to talk about is his beard, which I already covered in the Breaker video. Let's just say that I hope he never has to deal with a chemical attack.
Uh-oh, it's seeping in!
But now that we've looked at the molded parts of the figure, let's look at his included equipment. In Rock and Roll's case, that only consists of three things: his weapon, his helmet, and a bipod. As we've talked about in any number of other personnel office videos before this, the helmet's pretty standard. Surprisingly, his weapon and bipod are as well. The gun that Rock and Roll is carrying is a belt-fed, air-cooled M60 machine gun. It was in use by the various branches of the US military between 1959 and, well, I guess it's still in use in some capacity today, though it's mostly been replaced in Army units by the aforementioned M240 Bravo. The M60, or as it's affectionately called, the Pig, was widely used in the Vietnam War and actually comes in a few major configurations. Besides the normal infantry model that Rock and Roll carries, the other most common variety is called the Air 60, and has been used in several models of helicopters as the door gunner's weapon. The main difference being that instead of the single trigger on the ground model, the air model incorporates a dual handle and a butterfly trigger. Focusing on the version that Rock and Roll has though, the mold is really pretty close to the real thing, with a lot of nice detail. My only real point of contention is that conical muzzle, which is a lot different than the flash-suppressing muzzle found on a standard M60. Other than that, it looks pretty good, except that the bipod on a real M60 is connected to the gun itself. That means the gunner always has a support option when firing from the prone, or lying down position. Overall, I'm impressed by Rock and Roll's gear, and it's really close to real world. So what does Rock and Roll need to be even more real world analogous? Well, beyond the things most of this era of Joes needed, like a full LBE with canteens and such, he'd also need a pistol since most gunners carry one. He'd also need something that Short Fuse needed as well, which is an additional crew. The M60 is technically a crew-served weapon, and has 3 personnel assigned to it in a gun team. These consist of the gunner, the assistant gunner, and the ammo bearer. 7.62mm ammo is heavy, really heavy, especially when you're talking about it in reference to a weapon capable of firing 600 rounds per minute. Ammo belts for the M60 normally came in 100 round lengths, each of which weighed around 4 to 5 pounds, which on its own was pretty hefty. It's rare to see a machine gun crew carry less than 2,000 rounds, so normally this is split between the 3 crew members and the ammo bearer would have the majority of it, around half. The assistant gunner, on the other hand, would be responsible for carrying some ammo, the extra barrel of the gun, and a tripod, which would be used in long-term setups. Oh, and a heat-resistant glove used for barrel swaps. It's important to keep extra barrels on hand, because if you maintain too high a rate of fire, the first barrel can overheat and begin to melt. It's actually kind of cool to watch, because as the barrel gets hot enough, it turns a little translucent and you can see the silhouette of the bullets as they travel down it. Anyway, if the barrel starts to overheat, it's the assistant gunner's job to swap it out so they can continue firing. It's also the assistant gunner's job to feed belts as the gunner fires to prevent kinks, breaks, and jams. Meanwhile, it's the gunner's job to just focus on pulling the trigger and putting rounds on target. Honestly though, that's all the character needs, and any of the other Joes could have, and probably did, fill those roles. I wouldn't be surprised to find out that Grunt pulled the duties of an assistant gunner most of the time. But yeah, give him a pistol and a shave and you've got a pretty close representation of a real-world machine gunner. He's probably one of the closest in this initial lineup. But in the immortal words of Forrest Gump, that's all I have to say about that. In the grand scheme, I've got next to zero complaints and criticisms to leverage here. Next time, though, we get to look at our first Cobra characters in the series, with only a pair of them before we shift focus to the vehicle drivers from 1982. I'm hoping to make some easier videos like deep dives and personnel office more standard with my busier schedule, with things like my decades, films, and studio retros coming more like once or twice a month. Like I said earlier, though, the animated 90s and film will be coming next, then followed by the animated 70s. But in between, you can expect to see more of this type of video, top 5s or 10s, or more deep dives. Regardless for what else you come join me for in the future, though, thanks for watching this video, as I truly appreciate you being here. I hope you enjoyed this and can share it with your friends, like it, and subscribe to the channel for more. Thanks for watching, everyone. Stay tuned and stay tuned, as in cartoons. Later.